Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we have their solo album review, the newest project from the Mountain Goats called Bleed Out. But first, let's talk about dad rock. I think at this point the term is generally accepted with a shrug, a general understanding of what it means. Generally white, middle-brow, adult alternative, and indie rock spanning the mid-90s to, well, now, with a bit of a domestic, nostalgic feel, but also capable of kicking a little bit of ass if need be. Originally it was coined as an insult back in the 90s and 2000s, most often thrown at Wilco or The National, but eventually folks wound up embracing those bands and that sound, and while the term was never going to be cool, it was generally accepted in the discourse. Now, the interesting thing is that while the writer who popularized the term for Pitchfork might have intended it as a pejorative back in the 2000s, now being a little older, he kind of regrets using it as such, maybe even has embraced it, as have a lot of the bearded indie rock and indie critics set that have seen their tastes become passé as time marches on. It's why dad rock doesn't have to be cool. It's just a state of mind where you're old enough to not really give a shit about being cool. Now, that being said, given my own roots in country, I've got some messier opinions around dad rock in general. Yeah, winsome, sincere nostalgia can be emotionally satisfying, but those rose-tinted glasses can obscure some underlying structural issues and complacency that dad rock and its friendly critics don't often want to acknowledge. Hell, the natural extension of this philosophy can be Music Row, Nashville. That's a much uglier rabbit hole. Yeah, it might have the resonance, but what really underscores that comfort? What's allowed to be ignored? And why are we so comfortable letting acts rest on their laurels to pump out the same material over and over again in this genre? It's the reason I've never reviewed a Wilco album. There's no goddamn point. And all of this obscures how, like with other subgenres, there's a scale of quality within dad rock that tends to be brushed aside. Even if it hurts to prod in on some of that nostalgia, I've seen a lot of crap get a pass in this subgenre for precisely that reason, because why make a fuss about it? And it says something that a lot of white guys don't want to do the work to interrogate the art that underscores our own nostalgia. So enter John Darnielle of the Mountain Goats, who prior to this album, I would never slot into the whole dad rock paradigm. His interests were too niche and nerdy, his songwriting quirks a little bit too weird, and his sonic palette twisting into so many nooks and crannies. But he is also in his mid-50s, he is a dad, and when I started hearing buzz that the Mountain Goats' newest album was their dad rock album, based on the sort of over-the-top action films you'd see from the mid-80s to, well, now, I wasn't sure what to expect, mostly because John Darnielle tends to take a bit of a subversive, or at the very least challenging take on these subgenres, and that seems like the last thing you would expect from dad rock, where not being all that challenging is kind of the part of the point. But hey, after a few pretty understated albums, I was up for the Mountain Goats to kick a little bit more ass, so what did we get from Bleed Out? So at some point I may have said last week on social media that this is the Mountain Goats' best album since Goths, easily one of the best of 2022, and while I didn't get any backlash from that, most fans have been really on board with this one, I'm a little bit surprised it hasn't received a greater influx of acclaim, or at least attention, given that on some level, it's also the Mountain Goats' most straightforward and accessible albums in years, certainly the hardest this band has rocked since the early 2010s. Now granted, I wouldn't have opened up this review with a detailed discussion of dad rock if it wasn't going to play into some layered and complicated themes within seemingly simple compositions. The devil's absolutely in the details of this one. And while you can absolutely appreciate this as a straightforward, very comfortable, pretty damn great alt-rock album, dig even a little bit deeper and you'll find one of the most fascinating and layered explorations of those action films, masculinity, and the art around them that I've heard in a long time. And a big part of that is pretty obvious right in the face. John Darnielle has a unique, somewhat nasal tone to his voice, and no matter how much he ramps up to belt, and he does do it pretty well, he doesn't have the stereotypical voice that you'd often heard in adult alternative or dad rock. It's not gruff or deep or traditionally powerful in a rock or metal timbre, and when juxtaposed against the jangling guitars, more sinuous grooves, or even some of the horns, it brings a different energy trilogy to a series of songs about action movies. It's not explicitly subversive or parodic. Training Montage proves that Darnielle can still kick ass if he wants to. Can't wait to hear that live. But it immediately highlights someone who would be the everyman in the action movie rather than the stereotypical hero character. The same principle that came with initially casting Bruce Willis in Die Hard. But the language and style of this poetry on this album might as well have come from an action movie. It's more blunt and declarative, the sort of lines you'd expect coming from the Stallones and Schwarzeneggers and Van Dammes of the world, especially as it's predominantly in the first person. More importantly, it's not ironic. It's not being played for an obvious joke. Like with Goths, this is an album that recognizes the emotive power that can come from living and breathing in this scene, while also being smart enough with the framing to capture more angles within it, see the whole picture. And this is where Bleed Out really starts to come into its own. And you know what? Let's talk a bit about action movies. I recently rewatched Predator with my best friend a couple months back, and while that movie is a lot of fun, I don't think it would have the pure staying power if it does if all it was just cheesy action and big one-liners. They gotta make sense within the context of that universe, often a hyper-masculine, swaggering, guys on a mission vibe riding on pitch-black humor and raw charisma, an emotive appeal rather than pure logic. But let's be real here. Even the modern Christopher Nolan-esque action thrillers that have their own sets of corny one-liners, they operate on similar principles. They might run as an appeal to calculated reason, but if you dig even a little bit deeper, it's often pure nonsense. But hey, that's not a problem. Art has to be stronger than logic, so do movies. And Bleed Out gets that there's a gut-level appeal to those masculine-coded sentiments. And from training montages to street-level standoffs to the preparation montage to going out in a blaze of glory, it's all about to try to capture those escapist fantasies for kids or hell, the dads that grew up on it and still dare to dream. But John Darnielle also knows that taking those scenes outside of the context of the films can reveal a little more. Outside of the fantasy, they can come across as posturing at best and borderline grotesque at worst, rife with reckless paranoia, rage, and machismo that so many want to embrace directly. And this is where I think the production choices are kind of inspired with this album, because similar to how Goths took the pulse-pounding tapestries of darkness and then coaxed it through a slightly more normal tableau of jazz-inflected soft rock, how many Goths might actually lead their lives, Bleed Out takes subject matter that might be better equipped for thrash metal or hard rock, and then gives it a warmer dad rock palette. It's comfortable, it's warm, it's often major key. It evokes memories of the A-Team and action comedies, or maybe even cop shows. And that's intended as a compliment. This album might be stacked up with great hooks and anthemic moments that are so easy to cheer for, highlighting how much of this is just pure entertainment and can work on that level, but it's also accessible to a wider audience. And then when you add back those lyrics, it creates enough tension for you to start questioning whether cheering on for this is the right thing. Now, a lot of folks are just going to keep charging forward, and you know what? Fair enough. Despite this album's body count, it still needs to be entertaining to make part of its point, even with the sacrificial closing title track, and that's where the comforting embrace of dad rock's in its full swing. Just sit back, relax, crack open a beer, and enjoy it. But there's enough moments that are just dark enough to make you realize this isn't just lionizing those movies. I might think Wage Wars, Get Rich, Die Handsome as a killer bass gallop, but that hook might as well have been imported from the subtext of any Reagan-era action movie, or the gleaming flutter of the guitars on Make You Suffer that can't get past the downright sinister sentiment of the title line, or take the smoky rollick of Hostages, where the song just jams the hell out for the final few minutes, but the underlying sentiment is that when a villain has nothing left to lose, he's just gonna start killing people. He might run out of bullets, but he's not going to run out of hostages. But on the flip side, you get the horn-inflected swell of Extraction Point, where you get the commando prepping up for the mission, a theme later echoed in the Aged Fighter on Bones Don't Rust, or how Training Montage feels so goddamn anthemic, or the jaunty acoustic exasperation of Incandescent Ruins, where from a sci-fi scene, a soldier might be pinned down and can't escape, and you wind up rooting for him, similar to the desperate medic on Need More Bandages with a panicked, borderline post-punk guitar line, and the very eerie keys behind it. Now this is where I have to give a ton of credit to the producer, Alicia Bognanno, who did a lot not just to flesh out the underlying grooves and the percussion on this album, but also give it this loose verve that really translates effectively to this sort of rollicking action and keeps the sound from becoming interchangeable track to track. It might be very comfortable and familiar, but there's some diversity to the sound here, and again, a lot of melodic hooks. And I think that's at the core of the album. For as much as the project will showcase both sides of masculine art and archetypes, I would not call it an outright critique so much as a full contextualization. The methods of preparation and routine on Extraction Point, they're comfortable, they're familiar, they play to guys. But you don't get a pension for being that lone killer for hire. Guys in Every Corner is a great picture of that rugged hero with all his contacts against the system that are out to get him, like you're seen out of a mafia movie. But it could very easily just be paranoid rambling. Even Training Montage roots its main line on the hook for doing this for revenge. But there's always been an emptiness to vengeance that's once achieved, directly referenced on the following track, Mark on You. And while it works in the driving context of that moment, of that scene, when you pull it ever so slightly outside the fantasy, there's a different angle. You get a lot of hyper-individualized scenes and heroes where even if you're pulling the team together, it's every man for themselves, proving their own worth. But for what? The title track in particular highlights just how pointless this violence is. The heroes become mass casualties in the end. The blood will wash away, get forgotten. There's no words of wisdom. The blur of friend and enemy stops mattering. You just die. But the kids need a hero with the happy ending. So you skip past the grisly finale. The rest of the audience is going to lap up the sacrifice, the guys will shed a tear, and despite the grimmest of endings, there may have been value to the story being told. The problem comes when you try to translate the emotional reality of that fantasy to the actual reality in which we live. I mean, I'd say the closer parallel is Alan Moore's Watchmen and its searing commentary on how superheroes being real would only ever let us down, but Bleed Out is more empathetic in our desire for those heroes, even some of those masculine archetypes. There's an emotional truth that's closer to the end of Don Quixote. But I think the deeper note comes in how we perceive art in this lane, and maybe should keep it there, and that's amplified through the dad rock niche. It might be comfortable, it would prefer to gloss over the violence that comes in a hyper-literal translation if it moves beyond entertainment. But to paraphrase Darnielle himself talking about making the title track, there's a communal experience in the individualized moment where it just all pours out, and narrowing a focus. Nothing else matters but seeing it through. And it's funny, John Darnielle has mentioned in interviews that a lot of artists like to circle back to the process of writing about writing. Metatext that becomes the text. And I'll freely admit I'm a sucker for that as a writer myself. Hell, that was the majority of my book. And part of the glory of fiction is that imagination is an infinite resource. It can be stronger than logic and still have that deep-seated emotive pull. For as much as men want to ground everything in logic and ruthlessly define plans, if it's awesome enough, we kind of stop caring. But that doesn't map clearly to the finite reality. And that's the meta-modernist tension that gives Bleed Out so much resonance for me. It can be anthemic and deconstructive simultaneously and still feel powerful because we can grasp the reality and long for the excess, all amidst the comfort of a tone that we know well. Although maybe it's not a great thing that we get too comfortable. The album wants you to know that too. Of course, if you just want to take in the ride, the hooks are terrific, the jams are amazingly atmospheric and tuneful, the mix is impeccably balanced, the grooves are phenomenal, and it's still going to tug at your heartstrings on a number of occasions. For an album to work on so many levels, it's gotta be doing something right. And as for where it falls in the pantheon of Mountain Goats albums, oh fuck. John Darnielle's over 24 albums in with multiple classics. This could easily be one. I wouldn't call this a jump-on point where the 2000s runs still exist, but if you're looking for a smart, kick-ass singer-songwriter dad rock album, this is it. Goes down swinging, it's worth it. Check it out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be extremely grateful. I understand that this one's not getting as much traffic and attention as it really deserves. It's such a smart album, and I really love the depths that John Darnielle takes it through. I highly recommend you give it a chance. And again, even if the writing is not your thing, it's still so much fun. And I don't even think I got into all the little details. The one song talking about First Blood with John Rambo and the fantasies that we construct versus the reality of the situation. It's perfect there. But beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. If you guys want to help support the channel beyond just buying merch, link down there below, or hell, you want to argue with me on Discord or get albums onto my schedule, link to my Patreon is right over there. Don't feel obligated, tough times, I'll be okay, but if you want to, options available. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.